YouTube streaming, and we will now turn on the recording here. And okay, you are good to go.
All right, thank you. So I'm Robin Dillon Merrill, and I'm subbing for our session chair, Bruce Schneider, who is on the agenda. We are up to session 5, models. I think everybody knows the format by now. We're going to have 3 papers, each about 12 minutes, with a time for 1 or 2 clarifying questions if they keep to the 12 minutes. And then we'll have 15 minutes at the end for discussion. And my job is pretty much to moderate the chat. And so with that, I'm going to let Ben Harsha talk about an economic model for quantum key recovery attacks. So please continue, Ben.
Thank you very much. All right, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much for the introduction. Again, my name is Ben Harsha, and today I'll be presenting some joint work done with Jeremiah Blocky here at Purdue University. And this is an economic model for quantum key recovery attacks against ideal ciphers. So I do want to begin with a bit of background on the types of attacks we are considering. So we're specifically considering key recovery attacks in this talk. In this case, an attacker is trying to find some secret n-bit encryption key K for some ideal cipher, and the attacker also possesses some known plain text ciphertext pair M and the encryption of M under the key K. Now, in a classical algorithm, the best way to go about trying to find out this key with no other information is just brute force. Check all 2 to the n keys until you find the correct one and get the message back. And we note that this is actually the optimal model in the optimal algorithm in the ideal cipher model. To take an example, we might look at AES 128, common encryption algorithm with a 128-bit key. And we generally consider this infeasible to make the 2 to the 128 queries to find the correct key. But then we want to know, what about quantum attacks? So for quantum attacks, in many cases, they are very strong. Quantum computers can solve the RSA problem and the discrete log problem very easily. But these problems are not our focus here. We are specifically interested in these key recovery attacks. And in these cases, for ideal symmetric key ciphers, it turns out that even with a quantum computer, the time to solve these problems is still exponential. And in the quantum world, we're using something called Grover's algorithm, which for key recovery attack is going to run in order square root of 2 to the n time instead of order 2 to the n time. So an improvement, but still exponential. And we're going to consider AES 128 throughout this talk, and this would come out to about 2 to the 64 queries. So while 2 to the 128 calls really seems infeasible, we then can start looking at the question, well, what about 2 to the 64 calls? This might seem possible. And we can ask the big question, is AES 128 broken by quantum computers? So to answer this question, we contribute a new economic model for these key recovery attacks. And our model takes a few pieces of information as parameters. The first thing we're going to need to know is the value of the secret key K at some time t. And you can think of this value as just, what do you get out of succeeding in this attack? What is that worth to you in a monetary sense? And it's really dependent on the nature of the encrypted messages you're after. We're also going to require the dimensions of the quantum circuit. How wide is it? How many qubits do you need, and how deep is it? How many gates do you need to process? We need to know how fast quantum computers running these attacks are going to be. And we're also going to need some sense of essentially rental costs for quantum computers. How much does it cost to run that? And our big question here is, given our input parameters, is there some profitable attack that somebody can run? And in our case study of AES 128, we can specifically ask, is this sufficient to defend against quantum attackers? And I'll steal my own thunder here and spoil it. The answer is going to be yes, even under optimistic attacks for quantum attackers. So to go a little bit under the hood here in terms of what the Grover's attack looks like, we need to know kind of what this attack costs. And in this case, full cost is depth times width. In this case, we're looking at kind of a circuit model. And so our total cost is going to be essentially how deep is the circuit, the depth of Grover's algorithm times the width of Grover's algorithm being run. And what we want to note is that the depth of the circuit is proportional really to the depth of whatever cipher we're dealing with. In this case, AES, times the number of queries we need to make to AES sequentially throughout Grover's algorithm, while the width of the attack is proportional to the width of the AES circuit in a quantum circuit. And thankfully, some people have already done work in this area. They have implemented AES 128 in a quantum circuit. And the numbers we have for the paper, we find that the depth is about 58,000 gates, with the width being about 1,700 qubits. And if we actually combine that with the number of sequential calls required in Grover's algorithm, this is kind of the big number here, is the depth of a Grover's algorithm circuit is about 8.3 times 10 to the 23rd gates, which even under optimistic assumptions, you can think of as taking centuries to compute on a quantum computer. And I note that while these numbers are used in the paper, post-publication, some improvements have been made by Jacques et al. In Eurocrypt, and you can see more details in our paper about that. So if we have this situation where it takes centuries to run this attack, we obviously need to do something to speed this up to get the answer in any feasible or any useful amount of time. Excuse me. But we run into a problem where Grover's algorithm running over some domain is inherently sequential. That is, once you have started it, you can't break it up anymore. It has to run for a certain amount of time over a certain domain, depending on its size. And the only thing we can do to speed this up is to actually partition our domain, and think of that again as the key space in our situation, into K sections, and then we can run K independent Grover's algorithm searches. And we note that this method of parallelizing has been shown to be optimal. Note that once we've broken this up, our cost per block has dropped to the square root of the block size here. So order square root to the n over K, but we are running K independent versions, all of this size. And if we're looking at a width times depth perspective, our full cost actually increases by a factor of square root of K. So we come up to this, this trade-off here, which is that if we are going to parallelize this to finish it, the problem faster, it is going to run square root of K times faster, but we actually are going to pay more overall to do this by a factor of square root of K2. And that's going to be a significant factor here. So what does it again look like? We're just going to partition into K blocks and then run Grover's algorithm on each of these with this many rounds in each. Another input parameter to our model we need is some sense of how fast quantum computers are and how much they're going to cost to run. So here we're going to consider a unit called a cipher circuit year. And we're going to essentially use this unit that represents the use of a quantum circuit for some ideal cipher, which will be used by Grover's algorithm for one single year. And we're going to use this algorithm because that is essentially, you can think of as the rental unit we're going to charge for a quantum computer. And then we're going to consider multiple different scenarios for how future quantum computers might advance in the future. And we call these quantum mania, an optimistic scenario, and a steady improvement scenario for how fast they'll be, with quantum mania, for example, being a quantum computer that can evaluate 6.0 times 10 to the 2013 gates per second. And we're going to charge a rental cost of about $50 per cipher circuit year. And I'll note that while there is some sense of we can never perfectly predict the future, in crypto, we like to use conservative estimates. So we have picked fairly high numbers here. And I'll say that I've even asked my friend who's in quantum physics, even about the steady improvement scenario, about, oh, do you think that this is possible? And he just laughed at my face in return. But even then, we are considering more powerful ones. And while these aren't pulled out of thin air, for example, this quantum mania world represents what the National Institute of Standards and Technology considers to be kind of the maximum depth that you should consider for a quantum attack in their proposals for post-quantum crypto. So that's where these numbers are coming from. Another ingredient we need is this idea of a reward function. So what is information worth if you obtain it at time t? And we consider a few different reward functions in our paper. The first would, for example, be the threshold function, where information is worth some value until time ty, after which it's worth 0. So, for example, if you're somehow able to predict lottery numbers using an attack, those lottery numbers are only useful until the drawing happens, after which that information is totally worthless. We also consider a constant valuation, which is the same as threshold with the time being infinity, and this delta discounting version, which is kind of a smooth over time decrease in the value of information over time. So let's put this together and actually look at kind of some sample scenarios we consider. Let's look at an attack where the value drops to 0 after 100 years, which is, I mean, obviously a very long time. So if we look at our quantum mania world, in 100 years, we can evaluate a circuit of depth at most 1.9 times 10 to the 20 gates deep. And knowing this, we actually can calculate the level of parallelism we require, which is about 20 million independent Grover's algorithm circuits. So we have to have 20 million circuits that we rent for 100 years each, which comes out to 2.0 times 10 to the 9th cipher circuit years. We charge our rental costs estimates for this, and we actually come up with a cost estimate of $98 billion to run this attack. And I stress that this is with some of our most conservative estimates. So this is kind of the lowest cost we find. If I consider another sample scenario, with discounting in this attack, similarly, we find that with different time thresholds, say 10 years with a discounting or a delta discounting factor of about half, we're looking at costs or that the information has to be worth more than 10 to the 12 US dollars for any attack to be profitable. Okay, so to wrap up here and start answering questions, we have a few other results that are in the paper. So we also consider this profitability question backwards. We say that if we have a profitable attack, what does the computer need to look like to be able to complete it? And we find that any profitable attack requires infeasibly powerful computers. We also consider settings where attackers want to recover only 1 out of M keys. And you find that these can be profitable with a large enough sample size of keys, say 1 million. But even then, you might get only 1 out of 1 million keys after 100 years, which kind of dampens any use there. And again, see our paper for full details on these results. Kind of bring it all together, since we've proposed this new economic model for these key recovery attacks. And I suppose our big result at the end here is we had this question, and we can make this big claim now that under our model, AES 128 provides sufficient protection against quantum attacks for almost all secrets for the foreseeable future. And with that, I would like to open up to questions.
Okay, that was perfect timing. And you've got one question in the chat. Well, actually, can you keep your slides? Because I was going to ask you a question if you went back to your results, if you went back 2 slides. You got one question in the chat that was asking about quantum computers in general, and was asking why they hang from the ceiling. And I don't think I realized they did. So you may want to address that in general. But I think a more specific question is you did push most of your results to the paper, and you do have a minute or so to spare. Your second point, where there were some cases where something could be solved and where something could actually happen, could you comment for just a minute or so on those results? That seemed to be one of the interesting things you found, was that there were some cases where it wasn't unrealistic, correct?
Correct, but to kind of put this in context, this is an attack where, for example, you have managed to obtain 1 million plain text ciphertext pairs that you know, all encrypted under different keys. And essentially by batching them together, you can then ask the question, well, what if I'm willing to make a sacrifice and only have our attack return 1 correct key out of this million? And in this, for example, you might be able to reduce the cost to about $100 million to recover 1 of these keys. But I suppose then it comes down to a question for you. If you, in this case, value all of those secrets as less than $100 million, even if you lose them, you could still say that even if somebody's running this attack and they are okay with only getting 1 out of 1 million correct, and they're willing to wait 100 years, then you can still say that even if your secret's less than or worth less to you than $100 million, essentially, that this is still sufficient to protect against that. As for why they hang from the ceiling, I deal with theoretical quantum computers. I don't know the physics behind these. I'm sorry, I don't know either.
But they do, I guess. You do know that they do, I guess.
I guess.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I'll direct you to physicists on that one.
All right, we're going to come back with more in the discussion. We're going to move on to our second paper, which is Dan Arce from University of Texas, Dallas, and he's going to be telling us about security-induced lock-in in the cloud.
Hello, everyone. Greetings from Dallas. Today, I'm going to talk about security-induced lock-in in the cloud. The motivation I have for this talk is something that everyone pretty much understands that's in this meeting, that cryptography is not necessarily a good thing for everyone. It can lead to insecurity. And in particular, within the WEIS subculture, if you will, there's a lot of recognition that cryptography can be used against the users to which it's applied, and maybe even a tool to facilitate lock-in by providers of different types of information technologies. So this paper is going to look at what I call security-induced lock-in in the cloud. I'm going to look at cloud service providers. The use of cryptography is going to affect data portability and interoperability when one selects a cloud service provider. And because of the existence of cryptography, it's going to create a probability that a user can get their data should they want to change CSP. So it's not always the case that you'll be able to get your data if you want. It's not always the case that you will not be able to get your data if you want. It depends upon users' anti-lock-in strategies and CSP's lock-in strategies. So it's a 2+ period game. And in this 2+ period game, there's 2 CSPs. So it's a duopoly model. There's N total users, capital N total users, with lowercase n users being the number that selects CSP1 and its complement being those that select CSP2. One set of strategies for a CSP is are their prices in each period. And a CSP cannot commit to a second period price no matter what the SLA says when the user adopts the CSP. We all understand that once the point of adoption occurs, then things become a little bit pregnant. And so that's what I'm accounting for here. And in each period, the user selects their CSP. And one of the new things in this model is introduced a parameter delta I, which is the likelihood that a user can get their data should they want to change their CSP. So delta I is a probability. In most standard models of lock-in, delta would therefore be 0, meaning complete lock-in. You couldn't get your data if you wanted to change. But users have anti-lock-in strategies they can use. I've listed a few here at the bottom. And if anybody wants to help me add to this list, I'd certainly be willing to listen and take your examples. So the guts of what's going on can basically be illustrated by going through the details of the consequences of users' decisions. So the value that a user gets from selecting a CSP is their valuation less the price that they pay. In the first period, that valuation is constant across all CSPs. And that's because the initial decision to select a CSP is usually because what the user wants to do is they want to change their own fixed IT costs into variable pay-as-you-go costs with the CSP. So everybody has that motivation to begin with. But in the second period, things can change. In particular, in the second period, if a user they will have a higher valuation associated with that continued relationship, and that's in recognition of the learning effects that occur when you continue with the CSP. You become more adept at using the CSP, more attuned to what the benefits of the CSP are, et cetera, right? And that's actually a benefit of lock-in that often goes unacknowledged. And so therefore, in the second period, the user has a decision about whether to stay with the CSP or to change. And these have different consequences. So for example, if the user stays with the CSP, they get this heightened benefit. Okay, and that heightened benefit is net of the second period price. And if they're staying with the CSP, that second period price has to satisfy an economic condition of a no switching constraint. So it has to be, the second period price has to be such that the user will not switch CSPs. If the user switches CSPs, there's this likelihood delta I that'll be able to get its data in the switch. It then gets a first period valuation with the new CSP, because remember, it's not going to accrue learning benefits when it switches CSPs, but it also is in the first period of its relationship with the new CSP. So it's going to pay the first period price with that new CSP. So this is really the guts that's driving the paper right here, is the interaction of all these terms with a very important realization that security decisions are made within a particular economic context, and the particular economic context here is one of platform competition. So the equilibria for this game are determined as follows. It's a Bertrand game, meaning there's price competition. The CSPs are trying to maximize profits. It's solved via backward induction. So users are going to look ahead and reason back with regard to prices. So it's not possible to induce a user to adopt a CSP with a low period price if they realize you're really going to crank up the price in the second period. Users would understand that process. Second period prices, once again, have to satisfy no switching constraints. And then there's several types of equilibria that I'm going to look at. One type is a typical Nash equilibria, mutual best replies, corresponding to decision-making under imperfect information. And then the alternative is a Stackelberg equilibrium. A Stackelberg equilibrium is a leader-follower construct. It could be that there's a dominant firm within the market. There's other interpretations. And then something that's different in the most current version of the paper after the reviewers than was in the submission was the reviewers. Some of the reviewers said, "Boy, it would be nice if I had some repeated game arguments within this paper," and indeed I do now because Stackelberg equilibria do correspond to certain repeated game outcomes, and so thank you to the reviewers for suggesting that. And finally, in period 0. The CSPs and the users act to co-determine the degree to which the users can access their data should they want to switch through security-induced lock-in by the CSP and the use of anti-lock-in strategies by the users. So in a second, I'm going to talk about the equilibria and I'm going to characterize them. And so it's important that we're all on the same page when I discuss the properties of these equilibria. And I'm going to refer to several properties. One is a Pareto improvement for both CSPs. This means that both of the CSPs' profits will be higher as compared to a reference outcome. I'm also going to talk about a first mover advantage. That's where the first mover or the leaders' profits increase more than the second movers do. And then I'm going to talk about a second mover advantage, and that's where the second mover's profits increase more than the first movers do. And so the results are as follows. The prices are lower when lock-in is imperfect. Stackelberg leadership in prices is a Pareto improvement for both CSPs. But there's a problem here in that leadership in prices is kind of a facetious after you phenomenon because there's always the possibility that the second mover can undercut you, right? So then that raises the question, who would want to move first if we're in a Stackelberg game for setting prices? By comparison, if I look at lock-in, anti-lock-in strategies reduce prices, but the effect is piecemeal. It's only for the user itself because there's no spillover from anti-lock-in policies of one user to another user. Stackelberg lock-in is Pareto improving over Nash for both CSPs. And there's a first mover advantage if this condition holds, right? So I'm able to qualify exactly in economic terms needs to hold if CSPs are going to use security induced lock-in. And that is if the increase in profits due to security induced lock-in exceeds the difference between the price competition effects of both firms, right? And so ultimately what this says is the less sensitive users are to a CSP's price, the more they can gain by security induced lock-in. And so the upshot is as follows from this paper. I'm able to theoretically produce and qualify when security induced lock-in is beneficial for CSPs. Security induced lock-in is a form of non-standardization. And so it really shows how standardization is a non-starter for CSPs. It's to their advantage not to standardize. And then the question becomes, well, how do leaders reduce price sensitivity in the CSP market? And there's several ways that they can do this kind of thing. One is they can vertically integrate in the CSP stack. And the other is that they can, in their services, provide more economic value to the consumer. And if they go through this second process, then there's actually some benefit that comes out of security induced lock-in for the user, because users will benefit when the economic benefit to the consumer of security induced lock-in occurs in order to reduce price sensitivity. Right, so this is kind of suggestive of an evolution to Cloud 2.0 in order for security-induced lock-in to be something that firms can implement. And so I'll end there. Open for questions, comments, and suggestions. We don't have a rump session, so I just want to say UTD is doing a search for cybersecurity policy as well.
All right, thank you, Dan. That very nice management of your time too. We had one question here in that you were comparing two different CSP providers, and the question that you got was, what happens to the models, or did you consider if one of the options was to choose an in-house solution? Does everything change in some way if there's an actual in-house solution as an option?
Well, I haven't looked at that because that's a fairly well-studied question, right? So there's a lot of literature out there on the in-house versus out-house competition and lock-in. There's very little literature on within the CSP market itself competition, and so that's why I haven't looked at that. But there are citations within the paper corresponding to that type of competition.
Okay, and thank you, Dan. And we're going to have some more questions for you, but I'm going to save them for the general discussion. And we'll let, in the interest of staying exactly on time, we'll let Daniel Woods from the University of Innsbruck talk about the commodification of consent.
Yeah, sure. So I can't share my screen right now.
Is Richard our technical moderator? Do you know why Daniel can't?
Right now, I stopped sharing my screen.
All right, now.
Yeah, I can now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll have to do it like this. Cool. All right, so I am Daniel Woods, and I'm a postdoc at the University of Innsbruck, and today I'll be talking about the commodification of consent. So this talk really begins with these dialogues that I'm sure we're all very familiar with, and they have this kind of Orwellian statement that we value your privacy, and the we is not just the website, but also the collection of vendors who the website is collecting for. collecting consent for. And perhaps this would be better stated as, we value your consent. And that is exactly what this paper asks. What is the value of consent to ad tech vendors who use it as a legal basis for processing personal data? And what is the value or potentially the cost for websites who collect that consent? So our primary contribution in terms of the WEIS paper is modeling this, an economic model. But in this talk, I'll also touch on commodified consent in the wild, because this is not purely a theoretical phenomenon. So we begin with this observation that as users browse the web, they share personal data, not just with the website owner or the publisher, but also any trackers who are embedded in that website. And often those trackers, or at least some of them, will trade the data on to other firms. Now, under European law, these firms need a legal basis for processing personal data. So it's not just the website who has an incentive to collect consent. And in prior work, all we've ever really seen considered is a website collecting consent from a user and not considering this network of trackers. And that is exactly what we are considering today. We're considering the commodification of consent, where these trackers have consent collected for them by websites. So we begin with an economic model where here we have just one firm, so we've not considered coalitions yet where consent is shared, and the website can essentially monetize up to UI. So this is their user share that they can monetize. But under the law, they need consent to kind of extract revenue from personal data, and they can only do that for the fraction of the user base who will provide consent, and that is CI. So CI is always smaller than UI, and operating alone, the website can only extract revenue from the first CI. Then we consider firms sharing consent with each other. So this website J can collect more consent up to CJ. And we say if these two firms enter into a coalition, then website A can extract consent, can extract revenue from this additional share in green. We also, with the exact same parameters, can represent ad tech vendors. And we do this by setting C equal to 0. So why is C equal to 0 for ad tech vendors? That's because ad tech vendors have no way of actually collecting consent from users. Although they process personal data, they don't have a website through which they can present a consent dialogue. So this is kind of the fundamental problem for ad tech vendors. They actually have no way of obtaining consent. But if these three firms entered into a coalition, then they could extract revenue in the green. Well, ad tech firm K would gain the green share compared to acting alone, and website I would gain this green share compared to acting alone. So more formally, the model considers n heterogeneous firms who differ in these two values, UI and CI. They can enter into a coalition of any number of those firms, and they share revenue according to this identity. And this essentially says that a firm extracts VI per user share or per fraction of the user share, and they extract that from a total of the minimum of either UI or the most amount of consent they have. So they can't extract revenue from more than their user share, and also they can't extract revenue from any users who haven't provided consent to some member of the coalition. So we prove a number of propositions about this model. The first two propositions are under exogenous coalition formations. That means the coalitions have already been formed, and the only question is, how should the revenue be divided up fairly? And we use a solution concept from the 1950s, Shapley value, that essentially says that a coalition member's coalition fee should be equal to the marginal contribution to each sub coalition And if you look at the mathematical definition, it makes a bit more sense. But the outlook of this is if the revenues are shared amongst the consent coalition according to Shapley value, then coalition members actually prefer to be in a coalition with firms with bigger consent deficits. And a consent deficit is the gap between CI and UI. That's the fraction of users who provide consent and the fraction of users they could potentially extract revenue from. So proposition 1 says that no coalition member would lose if another coalition member increased the unconsenting user share. And then proposition 2 says that some coalition members may lose out if another coalition member increases their consent share. So this kind of motivates the question, what happens if firms could break away and form sub-coalitions? Could they gain? And our next two propositions consider exactly that, endogenous coalition formation, where firms can break away. And we show that under our partial ordering, which you should read the paper if you're interested in, the consent leader can actually extract all of the coalition fees. So we have strict winner-take-all dynamics, but these are bounded by competition in the form of the next most dominant coalition member. So the outlook is that we have winner-take-all dynamics under harsh competition. And I think we see a similar thing in reality, where no website that we are aware of actually receives a fee for collecting consent for other ad tech vendors and other websites. And that's because no website uniquely collects consent from a specific subsection of the users, because all users browse multiple websites. There's many websites who could collect those users' consent. And this essentially creates a thick market that means websites struggle to charge a fee. And I'll move on to what we see in the wild in a second. But there was one additional proposition we prove, and this is a model extension that essentially formalizes an observation by a Privacy International report, which observes that when firms enter into a coalition where they share consent, then user errors mean that each firm will ask for consent again and again and again. And even if you reject consent, you don't provide consent the first n-1 time, and then you erroneously provide consent on the nth time, then all members of that coalition gain consent. So this is just the observation that user errors asymmetrically skew towards providing consent, and this effect size is proportional to the size of the coalition. Cool. So now I'll move on to some of the observations we've made about commodified consent in the wild. So the first kind of necessary standard for commodification is a standard. So from grain to diamonds to online advertisements, you need some way of comparing goods. So you need to classify the same commodity so you can have this commodification effect. And given that online consent is an information good and you can have identical copies, we see that exactly this happens. And it's not that distinct products are treated as identical. The consent signals are identical because they all follow the same consent standard. So this is a web privacy standard created by the Internet Advertising Bureau called, again, slightly Orwellian, the Transparency and Consent Framework. And this standardizes the terms that users consent to. And we argue that this creates basically a thick market where so many websites are collecting the same consent signal that no website can actually collect a fee for that. But what we do observe, so this is observed in a measurement paper submitted to IMC this year with an additional co-author, Max, in our group. And this tracks the size of the global vendor list over time. So this is essentially a coalition of ed tech vendors who form together, and websites collect consent on behalf of these collect consent for this global vendor list. So there's 500 vendors on it. They each pay 1,200 euros, and thousands of websites collect consent for the global vendor list. And there's a real question as to why these websites do it, because they incur reputation risk, because every user who clicks see vendor sees 500 vendors and thinks this is creepy. And yeah, there's just no benefit to this. So to kind of conclude, consent has become a commodity because ad tech vendors demand it because they believe it mitigates legal risk. We've not yet seen if that's been if that will hold up in court, and also websites incur a cost in collecting it. We defined a coalitional game to describe this and describe how the coalition fees might be exchanged. And we have kind of loose validation. It's not empirical validation. It's more it's not quantitative validation, but we see the IAB have created a technical standard that's created a thick market for consent signals. And this seems to favor vendors because they have thousands of websites collecting consent for them, and they're providing very little in return. And there's kind of a broader point, and this is just the sheer absurdity that a legal concept designed to empower users has kind of been transformed into an asset that's traded among firms. So yeah, that was the talk, and thank you for your attention, and I look forward to any questions.
All right, thank you, Daniel, and thank all of my speakers for excellent time management. So I'm going to ask Daniel, I'm going to start with you and ask you a couple questions, and then we're just going to smoothly transition into the broader panel, and I'll come back and ask our other Dan and Ben a couple questions too that have showed up in the chat. But I think Tyler in the chat had, I think, a question that I certainly had, and that maybe other people also would have, is that when you're talking about this, is there any evidence that the users do or do not understand this whole coalition aspect of it? Do people realize that when they click yes on one site, they're giving consent to other sites? It seems like it's potentially deceptive. And until I saw your talk, it never really occurred to me that this might even actually really be happening. And so it's certainly not something that maybe people who just are browsing websites, the naive people maybe really understand.
Yeah, so first, in terms of is it really happening, there's an IEEE S&P paper in 2020 where they observe websites sharing consent signals between each other. Because what is visible to users is if they go to that dialog and click see vendors, they really can scroll through a list of 500 vendors. So to a certain extent, it is transparent to users. But yeah, many users don't bother clicking see vendors. So yeah, they don't know.
And so I guess the follow-on question on that is if that's not an option, then we can assume that this particular site is not part of a consortium because everybody is not doing that. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, so there's kind of two things. So there's the transparency and consent framework, which is linked to this global vendor list. And the vast majority of websites who adopt that collect consent for the global vendor list. There's a small minority who go for a manual solution that doesn't. But then also firms might independently collect consent outside of this framework. And there we have less evidence that there's consent coalitions going on. But yeah, of course there could be.
I think I'll ask you one more consent question, and then maybe we'll switch topics. But I guess one of the other comments in the chat was that the comment felt that consent equals revenue is true, but also was very disturbing equation. And so so how do you feel about the general process? I mean, it helps people make money and it's a revenue making model. But is there sufficient legal basis to process this personal information? Is this a good trend, I guess?
Yeah, so I can't speak to whether there's a legal basis for sharing consent signals. Personally, I think the main contribution of the paper is to highlight that websites are really getting a bad deal from this. They are collecting consent, incurring a big reputation risk, and yet they get very little in return. And then as to whether this actually improves privacy outcomes, I think you could argue that there's a little bit more transparency now that things are centralized. So if you look to the measurement paper that I linked, we can observe some of these things, but whether it translates into actual improved privacy, I think is a huge question, and only really regulators can probe that, because the things that are going on behind the scenes in the vendors' networks, we just can't observe.
Okay, great. And so then I think I want to switch back to our second speaker, Dan Arce. And I think, Dan, you are certainly reading the chat and responding to some questions in the chat already. But for everybody who's not following the chat, you certainly have gotten questions about some other aspects of your model, such as, did you consider welfare effects? And would you like to take a minute or two to comment on maybe some of these other aspects that folks were asking you about? Welfare being one of them.
So first of all, welfare effects. Yeah, this is, I'm completely aware that Pareto improvements for CSPs are not particularly good for consumers, right? But I'm going to take the same perspective as most economists seem to take, that, you know, the inability to coordinate amongst firms is a problem to be overcome, right? Instead of the role of antitrust policy to make sure that it doesn't occur, right? So I'm looking at things purely from a firm perspective. I did not look at things from the perspective of the effect on consumer welfare. And I'm explicit about that in the paper, right? I don't sidestep that issue at all. The other thing was with regard to the security of outside threats, with regard to malicious threats and things like that. Malicious threats are not in this paper, right? So the effect of cryptography is only on the user's ability to switch, right? So it's sort of a typical economic model where we're going to focus on one thing and blow it up to take a look at it. And obviously in the future, I need to look at the other side of the role for cryptography in preventing users from malicious threats as well. And I have done that in a separate paper at WEIS last year, and from the two, I could see it would be extremely complicated to take both on at once.
All right, thank you. And Ben, I think your co-author was also addressing some of the questions in the chat, but I was wondering if you wanted to take a couple minutes. I guess there's sort of at least a general message that I see in the chats is that, or general question is, questions around just the random breaking of keys is highly unlikely unless you get really lucky. And so I guess it's a kind of question of how important or how relevant are these sort of brute force attacks? And I think that your co-author was addressing some of this in the chat, but would you like to comment on some of it also?
So I guess I don't know what the question asker is talking about in terms of those brute force attacks, as in terms of a classical or a quantum sense. I'm trying to scroll up here and find their exact wording.
It said, fine.
I see it from Jeff Hall. So given the nature of brute force attacks on keys, not sure that some sort of random breaking of a key is likely unless you get lucky. I'm sorry if I misinterpret your question, but it looks like you're kind of looking at just randomly guessing keys until you get one correct in a classical model, which yes is unlikely, but that's not exactly the type of attack we are considering in this paper. We're looking at quantum attacks where it's not a sense of random guessing of keys. It's an algorithm that will return with high probability a correct key if the algorithm is run in its entirety. And if I misunderstood that question, please correct me in chat and I'll come back to it.
Yeah, I think that your co-author was addressing some of that too. And then I think some of the most recent questions then are going back to our third speaker, our third speaker and our second, Daniel. And I think you were also reading the chats and addressing some of these. But I think that there's a broader question about the consortium of firms or a large firm such as Facebook or Amazon who track data, which is then used in-house, but with other vendors. Like how do you define the consortium, or how are, not even how do you define consortiums, but how are consortiums being defined, sort of to your point about modeling versus in the wild?
Yeah. So I think it's a really, really good question, an example of where kind of competition concerns collide with data protection, because firms like Google, they maybe collect consent for Gmail, and then that consent could apply to Google Maps, it could apply to Google Drive, it could apply to all of their different services. So in a sense, Google have a kind of internal consent coalition in that all their different services can share consent with each other. So this kind of ties into this observation that Campbell et al. Make in a 2015 paper that we cite in our paper. And they basically say that consent creates, an effect towards market concentration.
All right, thank you. And then, wow, this moderating when you have people commenting on 3 different topics in the same chat is way harder than I thought I was signing on to do. But I think that given that we have just a few more minutes, maybe I'm going to, I got one more question here. Let me see. Oh, somebody says I'm doing great. I think we just have a few more minutes. So I think I actually just want to go back to each of the speakers and give you an additional minute or two if there's an additional comment or anything that you wanted to say to wrap up. So then I'll do it in the same order that we talked, which would be, Ben, is there any other final comments that you want to make, or even comments on any of the other 2 papers in the session?
Off the top of my head, I don't think I have any final comments. If you have any questions about the paper, feel free to email me. I believe the contact info is in the program.
All right.
I'd be happy to talk about it.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Ben. Dan, Arce?
Sure. I'd like to thank the reviewers once again. If asked, I will put the latest version of the paper up on the WEIS website. And then once again, if it was lost at the end of my talk, UTD is recruiting for somebody in cybersecurity policy at a tenure track position. So if you know anybody, please encourage them to apply. You can contact me directly about it.
Well, and I also think in the chat, you commented that you were working on the next paper. Can you take just a minute and comment on what the follow-on work is about?
Well, the follow would involve both lock-in, use of cryptography for lock-in with users, but also as a defense mechanism against outside threats.
All right, thank you. And then Daniel Woods, and maybe maybe I'll follow on with that same question too of what else are you working on, or what's the next steps for your project too?
Yeah, so I think the aspect we've considered, consent being shared among coalitions, is just one part of a wider picture about the standard by which consent is collected, tying to privacy standards more generally. And I think the evolution in this space is going to be really important going forward, because what we essentially have is the Internet Advertising Bureau have designed a standard without the kind of multi-stakeholder groups like the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium. And it obviously suits web ad tech interests. But then we also have privacy advocates who have defined, for instance, the do not track signal, and more recently, the global privacy control. So I think looking towards that kind of standards war going forward will be really important in terms of economic and privacy outcomes. So yeah, that's what I would point towards for future work.
And sort of this balancing of all of the different incentives to form consortiums, but then also maybe regulations against it and things like that. All right, and we are getting this. So I think that is the questions that we have. Certainly the papers are available and our authors are certainly very approachable, so you can follow up with them on additional questions if you have any. And Richard is giving us our statement that he's going to send people to breakout rooms, and then the next session starts at the time of zone. There's too many different time zones going on. The next time zone starts at 11 o'clock for my time zone, which is Eastern Standard Time. Thank you. Take your speakers.